Welcome back. Another episode of RX Radio. Excited to have our guest today, Dante Martella. He's a huge part of the Prescript Level 3 course. Dante's a strength and conditioning coach here in Toronto. Has worked in the pro ranks for about a decade of pretty much every sport you can imagine. Dante has become a really close friend of mine over the years. Dante has, it's odd to say, a subspecialty in communication, as you would imagine anyone at coaching at his level would. But his is distinct and profound. As you'll see in today's episode, Dante is he lends an interesting viewfinder on the career path of coaching, and an unbelievable storyteller, which I think just makes him an unbelievable communicator, or is a byproduct of him being an unbelievable communicator. So just a ton of fun having Dante just in our company in any way, shape, or form, whether it be podcast or whether it be alongside coaching the L3 down in Tampa, Florida. He'll be out there in June as well. So for those Prescript Level 2 coaches who haven't met Dante, this is a little bit of an intro. And for those of you who are not yet in the Prescript community, Prescript Level 1 currently up for sale. If you go to the website, www.pre-script.com, you can reserve your seat for next semester. This will make you eligible for January's L3 class. And just a ton of fun, a week of sort of an immersive learning experience, not sort of, an immersive learning experience down in Tampa, Florida, where we get to train some of the best athletes in the world, put what you've learned to the test. So without any further ado, Dante Martella, just unbelievable. We'll have him back on the podcast again soon. He's definitely going to be, and already has been, a requested guest, especially for those L3 coaches who got a little bit of taste of his skill set down in Tampa in January and February. Like I said, he will be with us in June as well. So you L2 coaches, a little bit of flavor of what you're in for with Dante at the helm of the L3 alongside me, Killian Hamilton, James McIntosh, Brandon Schultz also be down there. Maybe Jorge De Hoyos will grace us with his presence. But I hope you guys enjoy the episode. See you guys next week. Super informal, ladies and gentlemen. This is probably one of as formal intros I think I've done in a while, and a worthy candidate for such formality. A man who should need no introduction, but he's getting one fucking anyways because it's my show and I do what the fuck I want. Dante Martella, how are you, brother?
I'm good, buddy. Low key, we need this introduction. Nobody knows who the fuck I am.
Get the fuck out, dude. You know, it's one of those if you know type situations.
There you go. Yeah.
Yeah, man.
Yeah, I mean, a brief introduction. I'm a strength and conditioning coach in Toronto. Been in the game for 11 years now. Been fortunate, blessed to work with a number of different people in the world of athletics at all levels, and meet incredible people like yourself who have impacted my career in a really positive way.
So let's dig into the origin story. I think that's always a fun place to kind of see someone's trajectory, is like understanding where they started. Like, what was it that first sparked the interest? Because I'm always curious of people who have been, and it's funny because as you were saying, like a decade plus in the game, the only thing that like looking at both of us was like, yo, dog years, like 100% just dog years, city miles on a stop and go traffic. It's like, it was a different motivation then. Right? Because there are characters in the space that are doing cool things that everyone knows about, where it's like, I don't know, 10 years ago, there wasn't that draw. There wasn't a cool factor to what we do now.
Yeah.
What was the draw?
For me, I think maybe in a non-traditional route, I would say. I think you see a lot of strength coaches that either competed in high-level athletics and then kind of transitioned into training, or really had a passion for it from a young age and knew like, okay, I love training, crush the gym every day type thing, and then just grow their way through mentors and relationships into a position. And though I had, the ability to kind of find my way into those rooms, a lot of it started for me on the human relationship side of things. From a more formal standpoint, I would say, my upbringing, my parents owned a restaurant for 30 plus years in the city of Toronto. Myself and my three siblings, we all, in addition to my parents, lived above the restaurant and worked in the restaurant. And so there was this really interesting atmosphere where work is home, home is work. And I think that kind of stuck with me too, the ability to kind of really immerse yourself in the environment, maybe sometimes not necessarily by choice, but then you kind of tend to learn the value of it. And so obviously restaurant, food became a big passion. But food, not just for the sake of food for what it represents as like a gateway to kind of culture, a gateway to relationships, breaking bread, sitting down with people, getting to know them, these types of things. And then I kind of started getting interested in the nutrition side and maybe more of the science, the macronutrients, looking at the food on the plate, what exactly it represents as far as fuel for the body, and maybe starting to get interested in performance thereafter. But it always seemed like it was a world that was too far away, too far out of reach for me. And I didn't compete in sports at a high level. I didn't have this like burning interest at a young age for training. I think when I started training, like a lot of people, 15, 16, 17 years old, going to the gym, lifting weights, not knowing what the fuck you're doing, inevitably it kind of snowballs. You get interested in not just the actual gym environment, but what other things kind of impact that. Then that started bleeding into the idea of, looking into nutrition a little bit more. And I really thought that was going to be the route that I pursued. I went to Queen's University, didn't know what the fuck I wanted to study, just got a degree in general arts. By the time I finished there, I thought, okay, nutrition's this thing that's clearly I'm passionate about. Let's kind of dive in a little deeper. And I sort of, in that process of finding, what school I wanted to go to, what program I wanted to take, I came across all these courses that had to do with personal training. And I thought, you know what, might as well do that too, because I think, they're pretty synonymous, or they at least feed each other, this nutrition and training, two halves of the same whole kind of thing. And then that was it. I took a couple of programs in training, had an opportunity early in my career, made the most of it. It was a lot of, saying yes to every little opportunity, whether it was, something that seemed like it was going to go a long way or not. It wasn't necessarily the opportunity of, okay, you're going to train the sickest athlete in the room. It's like, no, go over there and make protein shakes and do laundry. And eventually that became, this opportunity to work with athletes, and just tried to make the most of every opportunity.
Now, with a decade plus in, if you were to do it, if you were to start now, knowing what you know about the state of the industry, knowing what maybe even about the evolution of the industry, because I think this is where the value for a lot of people, and there's always this like, I almost feel like getting into an industry, and I don't know why, maybe it's just our proximity to the industry we're in. I always feel like it's a multi-level marketing scheme. Like we're sitting here selling Mary Kay to people. It's just like, yeah, but if you get in now, in 10 years, you're going to be Dante.
Yeah.
But it's like, but Dante's going to be an oracle. It's like, that's besides the point. That's up for the oracle Dante to decide. But so it's like, how do you advise? And like, maybe even in that, in that summary, what are the changes you've seen that have potentially altered your approach to how someone might, get to where you're at in that time frame if they had to start now, given the state of the industry?
Yeah, I mean, obviously social media is a massive difference, and an accelerator in a lot of ways if you can use it as a tool. But like anything, there's a tipping point there, and I think we all are cognizant of when that tipping point hits with social media, and then it becomes this kind of cringy marketing tool where I think intent speaks volumes there, right? The intent, the goal that you have, that has to be crystal clear, regardless of if you're starting this, this year, 10 years ago, or 10 years in the future. I think, I want to work with athletes is too broad. It's too broad. I think you have to understand that that's kind of, in the future, that's what you're working towards in the future. But really, you have to boil it down to this first next step. It's like, okay, what exactly is working with athletes? What does that even mean? How is that different than just going to the gym and learning to teach a squat, or to teach a deadlift, or to teach someone how to bench? There's obviously a difference there. Like you see sports is so much more dynamic than just these basic lifts in the gym. And we can make those lifts as complex as we want to. But I think the intent of like, I want to work with athletes, it's a noble starting point, but I think you have to be a little bit more specific in that, okay, great. What's the next step? Like, do you know anything about sprinting? Do you know anything about change of direction? Do you know anything about improving power? Do you know anything about rate of force production? Do you know anything about these things that are very clearly different than what's in the gym? And I think there's an element of humility there, this idea of, you talk to a lot of people in these classrooms as young coaches. What do you want to do in 5 years and 10 years? Oh, I want to work with athletes. Okay, cool. Now what? So I think that ability to kind of maybe tap into social media, the people that you're following, those types of things should curate kind of, or at least mimic the path that you intend to walk.
It's funny because the word coach gets thrown around so often, and there's a distinction And I'm wondering at what point you started to make that distinction for yourself, because, for those of you unaware, Dante shows up branded as fuck. Wait till he gets thirsty. He throws up the Prescript water bottle. Quick plug. I'm sitting here drinking out of this fucking like a pleb.
It's respect.
But we got connected, and Dante comes down and helps teach level 3. And I actually had a question. It's funny, the other day someone posed a question in my DMs about the level 1, and they asked, why is it a coaching course? And it's like, it's not about level 1, it's about level 3. And you'll figure it out when you get to the end of the fucking story. Because there's difference between coaching and training. Now, I, Killian, and others, who teach within that framework, like Yo Murphy, we have no qualms about what we are. Like, we're not personal trainers. I wonder, when was it in your career that you started to adopt the moniker and what it meant to carry that moniker of coach, and what are some delineating factors in your eyes between a coach and a trainer?
Very early, I would say, and not necessarily as a conscious process. I think it was just the nomenclature that was being thrown around in the facility. Like, we're coaches, that coach over there, grab that coach. This coach is going to work with this athlete. And I think you just inherently or kind of intuitively adopted this coach-athlete relationship. And how that differs, I think, is from just trainer to client relationship. Inevitably, like, it's a bit of a spectrum there, right? Like, you could easily say a coach has, trainer qualities, but I don't think it goes the other way. I don't think a trainer always has coaching qualities. As a coach, you need to be a good trainer. And I think as a trainer, to aspire to be a coach is a great thing, but I don't think it necessarily comes intuitively with the moniker. And the differences for me are, on the technical side is the ability to understand biomechanics as a whole, load management as a whole. These are the things that we can apply to any client. It's not necessarily, a simple sport analysis, going to watch, a client or an athlete playing a certain sport, the ability to understand the positions that they adopt, what load is being put on their bodies, the forces that they're absorbing, how we're going to either quote unquote replicate those in the gym or address those in the gym. I think those are skills that you can apply to the average person, the average client. But a trainer with an average client, maybe they come in, the assessment process is pretty basic, and it's either way, we're still doing squat, bench, dead, or whatever it is. So I think there's a bit more nuance as coaches in their ability to assess the person, assess the human body in front of them, that differentiates them from trainers. But I think trainers should aspire to have those qualities, whether they want to work with athletes or not.
And then when you got in, like, when the moniker was kind of thrust on you, and maybe the delineation period took a bit of time to realize, maybe as you started to spend more time in the industry and see what trainers were doing, right? Like, getting thrust into a coaching role out of the gate is relatively atypical, as the ascension usually goes from a one-to-one PT and then going into a more traditional, as we would define, coach role. What were some things as you continued to learn that, a skill set of a trainer, oftentimes, the nuts and bolts of the technical, the biomechanics, very low barrier of entry when it comes to reaching the objective measure of the client, right? Like, as long as they don't get hurt, and it doesn't really take much to make an exercise safe enough for someone to go through, lose weight, and then for them to not get hurt. What were the big things you started to focus on as you developed as a coach, to continue to develop, understanding that coaching is, much more multifaceted and much more dimensional than training is? What are things that when you look at, or started to look at your skill set, be like, I need to start bolstering this. This is where I need to start paying more attention to. These are the big rocks that makes coaches great.
For me, it was the human relationship side, for sure. And as much as that was something that early on I alluded to being a passion of mine, I can remember, working behind the bar at my parents' restaurant, and you're meeting all kinds of different personalities, and you have to have this ability to kind of relate to these people and hold a conversation, whether it's a short-term transient today conversation, you never see this person again. There's an authenticity piece there that's important, or whether it's a regular customer, like, you have to be able to kind of meet the person where they're at, start to look at, and, this was all subconscious at the time, but it's something that I've consciously started to work on. And I think, working with athletes, made it very clear that this was very important. The idea of reading body language, the idea of tuning into, preferred communication methods, the ability to have strategies when someone comes in and presents a certain way that may be atypical or different from their baseline personality style, or personality type rather. And so I think that was very clear to me pretty early, because as I spoke about before, it seemed like this world was so far away from what I was capable of interacting with or even being around. Now all of a sudden I'm in my early 20s, and there's the A-list celebrities of the athletics world in this facility, and I'm the guy that's like has to go and change their weights or construct the program or whatever it is. And you realize, like, okay, they're struggling in a lot of ways with very simple exercises. So it's pretty easy to tell that like everyone's doing pretty rudimentary basic exercises here, at least in a certain phase of training. That's already taken care of, right? That's pretty low hanging fruit. They're going to progress with this. I already know what challenging exercises look like, and I can see them right now doing very easy exercises. So let's just continue to let them kind of stay the path there, and naturally they'll progress. But on the other side, you would see different styles of personalities emerge, different people who would control the music, people that wouldn't want to control the music, people that had respect for those who controlled the music, people that disliked whatever music was on, right? And so you see these natural kind of behavioral patterns sort of emerge. You see cliques start to form. You see people who carry themselves a certain way, how they come in at 6 a.m. versus the 3 p.m. group or whatever it is. And I think that's what I started to tap into it and prioritize at that point.
Now, when this became conscious and tapping into, now there's it becoming conscious where you're noticing these trends, and then there's really diving deep into them. What was the first maybe communication principle? You mentioned a few. You talked about body language. You talked about atypical behavior. What was the first that in the pursuit academically, extracurricularly, where you're like, wait a minute, I'm going to start actually looking into what is the science behind this type of trend that I'm recognizing, which I think is like, it's almost just a regular pattern of curiosity and inquisition. Like, we just have this superseding awareness that brings something to our conscious thought, and then we go through and we deliberately expound on it. Do you remember, or maybe you could even share a few of those principles, and as you dug deeper than the surface level awareness of them, sort of what you learned and how that learning started to evolve your coaching further?
Yeah, I would say it's the priority of, or how we prioritize the limbic system, or how the limbic system really affects our behavior. The limbic system being responsible for our emotional responses, and really how we as humans have kind of this negativity bias. So when you look into some of the science around the psychology of human behavior, it's very clear why we remember. One of my favorite movies is Rounders. Matt Damon, Ed Norton, John Malkovich. Have you seen it?
Yeah, 100 years ago.
Like outstanding movie, cult classic. I watch it probably once a year. And so Matt Damon, the character in that movie, talks about how he can remember some of the great hands that he had as this kind of underground poker star, but those fade immediately whenever he has a bad beat. And it's the bad beat that he starts to remember all the details of with like painstaking recollection and accuracy over time. And eventually that's the only memory that he has. So he doesn't necessarily have this recollection of how he built up his bankroll as this underground poker star, but he can't stop thinking about the time that he lost it all, because negative emotions have such control over our behavior, over our decisions, and eventually those decisions lead to new experiences and new memories and shape our biases as human beings. And I think the acknowledgement of some of those goes such a long way. And so that was probably the principal concept for me, was we unavoidably have this, bias towards negativity. So I think being aware of that, is definitely a place to start.
Now, limbic system, like you kind of jumped off a cliff there. I was like, hey, you kind of noticed people at 9 a.m. were different than people at 3 p.m. And then you kind of like went down the neuro rabbit hole. Like when you got into this extracurricular study of communication, did you anticipate it at first to go so deep? Did you anticipate to be exploring it at the level of the neurophysiological? Like, and how has understanding that, one of the things that I always make the comparison to is like a really expensive watch, right? Like really expensive watch, it still just tells you the time. And whenever we look at the brain, we have all of these inner workings and these movements, and but at the end of the day, it's insightful. It's sophisticated in the sense that the action is very precise.
Mm-hmm.
One, were you surprised by the depths of how far this stuff could go for something that is so by nature autonomic? And then two, have you found yourself self-critical as a byproduct of it, or how do you then, understanding all this, does it change the way you are fundamentally? Like, is it something where when you learn this and you can't unlearn it, you start to become, because I've seen this in people who start to dive into this, is like they understand that we can sort of shape shift, and then they forget sort of who they are in essence. And the one thing I've noticed about you is you always show up and you're always you. There's a snap or a clap or a distance or a tone or a volume that changes. But how was navigating that sort of pedagogical pursuit of communication in the early days, and how have you learned to assimilate that into the way you practice?
I think it's challenging. It's definitely challenging. You question yourself, you question who you've been, who you want to be, these types of things. And I think that's all part of the process, right? Like, I think that in the pursuit of being a better communicator, in the pursuit of having a better understanding of human behavior, of psychology, these types of things, inherently it comes back to this idea of the process, right? And that's such a general word that gets thrown around a lot, maybe even bastardized at times. But ultimately, what I take from that when I think of the process is slow down, right? This idea of the ability to just understand and appreciate the moment for what it is, as an opportunity to improve, and nothing more, nothing less, right? And so there's this concept in Japanese culture that's called kintsugi, which speaks specifically about, it kind of falls under a broader umbrella term, which is hilarious, wabi sabi, but I'll get to that later. Let's just talk about kintsugi for a second. So kintsugi is, there are these ceramic bowls that are popular in Japanese culture, and there's a transience or an impermanence that is fundamental to both kintsugi and wabi sabi. Wabi sabi is more of a philosophy, like an overarching philosophy of appreciating the impermanence and the transience of our experiences here on earth. This idea of less is more, appreciating the moment for what it is. To me, that speaks to the process. When we look at kintsugi, or this art of these ceramic bowls, there's an appreciation that when the bowl breaks or there's a crack in the bowl, the breakage and the repair are actually part of the history of the object. So it's almost like you're waiting for the time that this bowl is going to break so that you can fix it. And the art behind the repair of these bowls is that typically those lines, those cracked lines, when you have to put the two pieces back together, are created with this like acrylic powder that's either gold or platinum or silver. So it almost elevates the object, and not only just says like, we repaired this object or put it back together, we're highlighting the fact that this is exactly where it broke, because we want you to know that it's such a fundamental part of the history of this object. So I think concepts like that, and thinking about human nature, thinking about human behavior, a lot of people struggle with, whether they're high performance athletes or not. A lot of people struggle with I'm feeling anxious about this stage of the process. Our ability as coaches to tap into what exactly they're anxious about is important. But this overarching philosophy of reinforcing that, listen, it's okay. Like, this is just a small part of the process. This is today. We just have to win today. This is the plan. We have a plan. You can have confidence in the plan. Here's the evidence of success. But let's just remember that everything, including today, is an opportunity that if you waste it, it's gone. It's transient. It's impermanent, right? So I think when you help people refocus on the process or bringing it back to the moment, it's pretty powerful.
So it sounds like that would be advice sound for both an athlete and a coach. As you've kind of developed within the coaching space, what have you had a more difficult time? What's a more difficult group? And maybe there's no answer to this, but as you now coach coaches on, amongst other things, communication principles and coaching, but also simultaneously coach athletes, what are maybe the similarities and differences between coaching coaches and coaching athletes when it comes to communication? Like, what are the roadblocks that you run into with each population, and how do those roadblocks either compare or contrast?
Yeah, addressing their fundamental insecurities in some way that's still within scope and that doesn't make me a therapist, or that I'm treating them or diagnosing them or anything like that. Just talking people through that. I think when you recognize that people tend to project their insecurities either on one end of the spectrum or the other. People tend to either shy away and be very meek and calm and in the background, and they stand at the back of the class and they don't put their hand up to answer questions. That's one form of kind of representing and not that it's always an insecurity. Someone may be very confident and they just want to observe, and that's cool. Maybe you're wrong as a coach in your initial assessment. That kind of comes with conversing with the person and understanding them better. And then the other side of it is almost this overcorrection, this bravado, this machismo, this confidence. The person who interrupts you when you're speaking, the person who can't wait to put their hand up. And again, there's always, a spectrum. That doesn't mean everyone that puts their hands up or interrupts you is overly confident or needs to be talked to or put in their place or whatever. But these are just tendencies of human behavior. And I think those parallel, I would say there's a lot more similarities than differences in my relationship with coaching coaches and my relationship with coaching athletes, which is why at the end of the day, it's called human behavior. It's not called coaching behavior or client behavior or athlete behavior. It's humans as a whole. So these are the patterns that we tend to adopt. These are, the psychological rabbit holes that we tend to go down. And there's a reason for them. And I think the best way to start addressing those, or the best way to start getting better at them, is by looking within and sort of appraising the strategies that you have. Am I someone that interrupts people? Audit that a bit. Am I someone that tends to sit back in certain situations? What environments bring out what type of behaviors for me? And then you start to ask yourself why and go down that rabbit hole.
Now, before the process of deliberate understanding of human communication, that undertaking that you've the rabbit holes that you've gone down, since becoming aware of this being such a transfixing and transcendent part of what you've always done, what were some early lessons that you learned, and maybe how did you learn them? There's guard, and what's one of the joys I think of training athletes is that there's an unfiltered nature, there's an urgency, and there's in some cases just a lack of shame or fucks, to coin a phrase. What are some early lessons that you learned where you're like, hey man, hey, when you oversee another coach, be like, let me tell you, son, this is how this is going to end up?
Yeah, I think it's the same lesson over and over again. And I don't think I'll ever stop learning it. It's that you don't always get it right. You don't bat 1,000, you may have this assessment of, or you may have this, potential assessment of how someone behaves. And maybe you've asked certain calculated questions to better understand them. And emotions are challenging. So let's say they're in the heat of the moment. You have an athlete who's a bit quieter and you're trying to break the surface. You're trying to get to know them a little bit better. And they hit you with a cold shoulder and they turn around, don't answer your question and walk away. I've had that happen, right? It's challenging. And I think the lesson there for me is don't take that personally. As hard as it sounds, it's you have to play the long game a little bit too. I think when you learn something new, when you hear about something new that you're like, oh my God, this human behavior, I don't know anything about that. I need to apply this immediately. Just like if they learned any, the training principles that you guys teach in level 1, it's mind blowing for some trainers, right? And they're like, I need to do this all the time with every client starting yesterday. And it's okay, cool. Even if you do that, you're not going to be batting 1,000. You're not going to be awesome at it. You're not going to be Jordan Shallow right out of the gates. Hopefully it's something you can build to over time. And I think the awareness, the conscious piece, and also give yourself a pat on the back. If you look at these concepts and you think, damn, that's something I want to learn more about. A lot of people are going to hear this and be like, whatever. I've been coaching for 10 years, 12 years, 15 years, 20 years, 5 years, whatever. I know what I'm doing. I don't need to learn any of this stuff. And I think, it doesn't hurt you until it does. I think when you lose a client that you potentially could have retained because they walked away because of some difference in your relationship or how that changed over time, that's money in your pocket. That's not insignificant. So I think for me, the lesson was definitely, you're not always right. and you have to have strategies yourself when it does go wrong, particularly on the gym floor. And I can think of a few different examples where an athlete turned around and like halfway through my sentence, and I was just like, oh, never mind, disregard. We'll approach that later. And inevitably I approached the athlete after in a different environment. I didn't try and force it in the gym when the music's loud and there's 5 other people and clearly this guy just wants to get through his workout. I sent him a text at the end of the day, hey, all good, if I'm around if you want to chat. He approached me the next day. We went outside, we had a little chat together. He had some stuff going on that was family oriented. He was very open and honest and apologetic for how he responded the next day or the day previous.
Do you have any like highlight and low light reels? Like where you're like, some days if you're wondering like, fuck man, like why do I do this? And you think back on like, we've had some big dubs, and like more specifically and I guess it all falls under the umbrella, as you mentioned, of human communication, but like, or human behavior. But on good days to maybe humble yourself, do you have that low light reel of like, yeah, but remember that one time?
Yeah, I think we spoke about this on when I hosted you on my podcast. It was probably the first pro athlete I had ever worked with. It was like a highly touted 2nd round pick in the NHL, was flirting between the AHL and the NHL. And so it was like a big summer for him. And he couldn't make his workout time slot, so he had to come later in the day. And I was, the yes man. So I was like, yeah, whatever, you can train him. And I was like, yeah, awesome. Right. So the workout was like sprints outside on the field and band resisted sprints. Like I'm holding onto the band, working on acceleration, working on these starts. And it's hot as hell outside and these bands are old as hell. And so I wrap the band around his waist. He takes off the band. Like I'm, decelerating after him. The band snaps. He goes flying forward. The band rockets back in my face. And I'm like, oh my God. Like I don't have the tools. It's like, I literally don't have the tools. The band's gone. But I don't have like the psychological tools to be able to, deal with this right now. But I do remember feeling this moment of like peace, because it's like, well, that's done. Like the band's already gone, right? I can't re-snap this band. So I think there was this moment of like almost appreciation for the moment, like we were talking about earlier. And it's like, okay, well, literally your decision is either think of something on the spot, or my building is right there. I live right behind the gym. I could see it, or I go home and never come back. Those are really the only 2 options. So obviously I just thought of something on the spot and I'm like, okay, first of all, are you okay? It's a pretty serious rug burn that you got going on in the knees, but we're good. Let's go back up to the gym. Went back into the gym, cooked up a little workout, continued. And I thought, we're good now. I think we're past that. We're chatting again. Everything's fine. Interest set. And he says the athlete had just filled up a little bottle with some amino acids or whatever. Bottle's full, like just put his little shaker together. And he's sitting down in between sets. And he's like, hey, can you toss me the bottle? So I toss it and I under toss it by like 1.5 feet and it explodes all over the floor, all over him. And I'm like, okay, so we're back to square one. Clearly it can get worse. I can break bands and I can break bottles. I feel good about the amount of shit that I can fuck up here as a coach. I'm feeling really good about having access to all the things that I can screw up. And I think the more of these like mistakes that you make that aren't catastrophic, the more you realize that, that's just part of it. The more you realize like, oh, next time somebody wants a bottle, I will literally like grab their hand and put it inside their hand and then maybe even like feed them the water or whatever it is. So things like that definitely stick out, and there are no shortage of them. There might even be a video on YouTube at one point. There was like a chin-up competition we were doing, big introduction from the head coach, and it was like being filmed. There was this media day, and there was like a band-assisted chin-up that everyone, like this train of 20 athletes was going to come by and do 3 little warm-up chins with the band, and then we were going to do like a chin-up comp, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 reps, 6 reps, 7 reps, until there's, last man standing. And it's literally this big introduction, cameras roll and the whole bit. And then ready? Okay, everybody's ready to go. Boom, music turns up. I pull the band down, snaps again. Literally pull the band down for the first guy to warm up. The band snaps and the camera's like right on me. And I'm like, okay, somebody grab me a band, boom, hook it up and go again. So there's lots of little moments like that where, I think Chris Voss was talking about this, the FBI hostage negotiator, that like embarrassment is literally quote unquote, weakness leaving the body. You have to let that happen. You have to just like sit in that moment and just, laugh it off.
Yeah, I think that the big takeaway there is it's it's the amount of time it takes. It's the refractory period to the enjoyment of the moment. That's like the sign of wisdom. Because like there's times where you're like, oh fuck, I can't show my face in here for like a month. But if you can get that time down to like quite literally a couple seconds and you're laughing it off before the bottle hits the ground, it's like, okay, that's where you just know you've made a lot of mistakes. But I think there's, we can sit here and, we talk about maybe a low light reel, but honestly, like that's the shit you remember, right? We know that almost from your Rounders thing where it's like, if you can frame that as a positive and like, these are the funny stories that you could share, and this is still the beginning of your career, by our estimation of what you have planned for the future that, we've obviously discussed a lot off air, but it's just like here, if someone can maybe take a warning away, or maybe not a warning, a lesson, and be like, well, here's a guy that, perennially works with the best athletes in the world. And, early in his career, he, fucked up habitually, it seemed, that one day, and he's still out in the ring taking punches that, at the end of the day, it's like, well, that's maybe the good stuff. Now, what's the, especially from maybe through looking at it through this lens of communication and human behavior, like what have been the big wins? Like we had Mike Boyle on the podcast a handful of months ago, and he told a story about Cam Neely and how Cam had scored a certain number of goals the season before and didn't like to train and sort of had this, and this is obviously back in the day, we're talking Cam Neely here, so you can date that, and all you hockey fans out there, but he went to Cam, and Cam kind of like was very abrasive and was like, I don't want to train. I scored 40 goals last year, I think it was. What do I need to train for? And then Boyle goes in his locker one day and puts a list of all the guys that have scored 50 goals last season, not 40. And he goes, I'll be in the gym if you need me. And then all of us, they became best of friends. And then Mike became sort of this Boston darling of the strength conditioning community. Do you have anything that comes to mind when you go for the highlight reel and be like, here is something, here's a well-executed bottle toss metaphorically?
Yeah. I think one that stands out is Mike Camilleri. So we played over 1,000 games in the NHL, like, unbelievable career. And he was also a guy that was the type, when he was in the gym, there was this like level of respect that people had for him, certainly towards the end of his career, but even earlier on, because he was a pretty gregarious personality, not afraid to say what was on his mind one way or another to anyone, to the coaches, to the athletes, or whatever. And so in the NHL, or in hockey in particular, like chirping or ribbing or giving each other a hard time is definitely a part of the culture. And I think as a young coach, maybe because of those previous mistakes or just because of my personality in general or whatever, I, in this very kintsugi kind of method, I looked forward to those moments where it was like, okay, I know if something goes wrong, quote unquote, goes wrong, I already have this level of, this barrier around me that I know it's not going to be too far out of my ability to kind of fix the situation. And so Cammy at one point, wanted to do some stretches at the end of his workout. So I took him into the gym and put together this little routine, and another athlete had joined, this goalie, Andy Kyoto, who's, he could do this podcast on human behavior and psychology like the back of his hand. Just brilliant guy to talk to. Currently the goaltending coach for the Pittsburgh Penguins. But Andy and Cammy had known each other for a long time. So Chico, we called him Chico, Andy, jumped into this little stretching session. And by the end of it, they both came up to me and were like, listen, I really like that. Like there was some different stretches than we've done before. We both worked out for like 30 years. This is, can you send me a list of these? I said, no problem. I'll send it to you tonight. And that was in the morning. A whole day goes by, 30, 40 athletes come through the gym. You're coaching every hour on the hour. By the end of the day, like some things slip through the cracks in the brain. And I said, I would send that to you tonight. And I didn't. And so the next morning, we're doing laps of the track. It was actually raining outside, so we were doing laps in the school gymnasium, the high school gymnasium next door. So we're warming up, and they're doing a couple laps around, and Cammy calls my name while he's doing laps. And he's like, come run with me. And he said it in like a pretty serious tone. And I was like, oh, maybe he like forgot his water bottle or needs a towel or something. I don't know. So I leave my post of setting up the workout, and I start jogging laps with him in this pack of like 20 NHL athletes who are all chirping each other a whole bit. And he goes, what'd you fucking forget? And I'm like, right away, I'm like, I don't know if I should laugh this off, but this sounds pretty serious. I'm like, forget what? And he's like, you told me you would send me those stretches last night. You didn't send me them. I'm like, oh, fuck. Sorry, dude. I'll send them to you. I'll send them to you today. So long story short, we get through the workout, and he said some very colorful, he had some very colorful language and chirped me pretty good through that entire session. Some of the stuff that I won't say on air, but needless to say, it was very motivating for me to send him this little list of stretches. So on my lunch break, I went and I cooked it up like a PDF, perfect document. Everything was like bolded, underlined, link over here. And I sent it to him that afternoon, like before the end of my day. And then he sent me a little text, super appreciative. So it was very clear, him and Andy were both very appreciative of this gesture for me to make it not just like a text of like, here, do these stretches. It was do them this long. If you're going to do it after the ice, do it this long. If you're going to do them before the ice, do them like this. Here's a different variation if you feel X, Y, or Z. So I went, above and beyond. And that was kind of a strategy that I tend to adopt as, a bit of a psychological people pleaser. I think when something goes wrong, I want to go above and beyond and not just fix it, but make it better. And so I think the little text, the little moments of appreciation that these guys have, whether it was after a screw up or not, and Cammy himself, true to form, was a guy that, again, he would rib you quite a bit, and it was all, in good fun. I'll tell you one off air. One time he was doing a glute ham raise, and, he gave me one pretty good. But I think because I always hung in there with him, because I was always, regardless if it was a one-on-one session where I knew he was going to be on you, that he wanted things done a certain way, you can hang with them, you can show them that you're supposed to be there. He would always, at the end of a summer, have like a handwritten card that he would come and deliver to you by hand that said, not just like, hey, thanks, here's a little tip. It was like, listen, you've grown a lot as a coach this year. Here's what I saw last year. Here's what I see that you're doing this year. Keep going. You're doing such a good job. These types of things that mean so much more than anything in this industry to me, because it's evidence that, you're doing something right.
Now, for coaches listening, like I'm sure at a certain point, whether even not unconsciously, but maybe subconsciously to consciously, that they've been in the industry long enough to start to establish some of these behaviors and trends, or at least to recognize their existence. What are the things that you think now in the coaching space are points of priority when someone is looking to develop this maybe more technical side of their coaching game, right? Like, and maybe technical is the wrong word, although, when we're talking about the limbic system, it's hard to think of that in any other thing other than technical, but, maybe from a subjective standpoint, it could also be seen as a tactical. When we're looking at human behavior as coaches, looking to get our foot in the door, what is the extracurricular? What is the work that starts to really move the needle for someone who's trying to be? And because here's the thing about good coaching, and someone asked me this the other day, is you don't know what it is, but you know when you see it. It was sort of the answer I came up with, because it's so fun to be in a room with like good coaches, because the thing that drives me fucking nuts is like, there's a sanctity to what we do, I think, and that's one of the reasons why we do it. We value the human communication piece, but the word coach now is just like, and I don't want to be too disparaging, because I had friends who spoke at the event, but like, I think what we do at level 3, not to pump our own tires, is coaching con or whatever the fuck. There's some bullshit event down in Orlando, some keynote bullshit where everyone wears those goddamn microphones they tape to their face and just do raw bullshit from the stage. But it's like, you want to talk coaching con, put Yo Murphy and Dante and Killian and me and Jay in a room, and then just like, it's an orchestration. It's there's movements, there's X's and O's, but there's also paint strokes and emotion and volume and cadence and vernacular and language. And it's like, when you don't know what it is, but you know what it is when you see it. What are things like, if you could say, hey, you're a new coach, let's just do these couple things and your ability to communicate will be exponentially better, what would those couple things be? 2
things. One, accuracy versus abundance. I think the coaches fall into this trap of wanting to say more words, wanting to say not just more words, but the best words, and have these very fancy anatomical lingo. And I can't tell you how many times I've seen coaches tell athletes or clients soleus or fucking medial hamstring or what. I'm like, what? Like, they don't even know what that is. Not only that, but they're in this like new foreign position. How could they even possibly recruit that to a greater degree or whatever? Like, first of all, set the exercise up in a way that's going to get you what you want out of it efficiently. But I think when it comes to communicating, less is definitely more. And that goes back to this, the overarching, Japanese wabi-sabi philosophy, where it's not about the best words. It's not about having the most words. It's about the accuracy of your words, what's needed at that time. And to simplify that, Ben Bruno talks about this brilliantly. Like ironically like to be a bit more, verbose about these types of things. But Ben Bruno talks about it like this. He says, when he's talking to a client, he speaks client. When he's talking to a coach, he speaks coach. It's very simple, right? So when you're talking to a client, if they say, is this squat good for my quads because I want to get my quads bigger? Yeah. If the next person says, is this squat good for my glutes because I want to get my glutes bigger? Yeah. You don't have to talk about the nuances and the biomechanics and the knees over toes and what hamstring you're recruiting and whatever. If it's yes, the answer is yes, right? Like they care about a pretty superficial level. Is this going to get me closer to my goal, whoever it is, client or athlete? Some people are going to want to go down the rabbit hole a little more, be my guest, entertain that. But I think this idea of accuracy versus abundance goes a long way. And then two, I would say, in this pursuit of being a better coach, intuitively, there's this very kind of singular, this piece of solitude that kind of comes with that, where it's very easy to want to constantly think about yourself improving. Just as you mentioned, if we were to all get in a room with the aforementioned coaches, we would be part of a team. Each one of us individually would be part of a coaching team. And I think that's something that sticks out for me at L3 is by the end of the week, you really hear some of these comments, this feedback from the coaches that they didn't just get better at coaching themselves. They got better at working as a duo with another coach. They got better as working as a duo within a larger team of coaches. They got better at switching off between athletes on and off, these types of things. They improved their communication styles. They improved how they appreciate and understand the importance of human behavior. So these types of things all are synonymous for me with the importance of recognizing your role within a team.
And is there an inverse to that? And maybe in a little bit more depth than obviously make sure you do the things that we're saying, is there things to avoid? Obviously avoid abundance over accuracy, but are there things that it's like that you see that are just very simple mistakes that if we did the accurate versus abundant, we understood the team dynamic as a coach, and we also, I find motivation, and I don't find motivation. Motivation is fairly clearly defined as sort of the carrot and the stick. These are carrots that coaches can run towards. And I think, some of my favorite coaching moments have been when I said nothing. And I think that's almost unanimously the case. And I have some, in my mind, in the corpus of my coaching story, some pretty biblical stories of what happens in the power of silence. But it's like, what are things that you can what are the sticks? Like, okay, we're going to focus on accuracy over abundance. We're going to understand the dynamic of a team as a coach, but we're also going to move away from these practices that we also see so commonplace that are detracting from your ability to be a world-class coach.
Yeah. Describe, don't diagnose. I would start with that because that fits with this less is more. That fits with accuracy versus abundance. That fits with the power of understanding the role that silence plays in communication, or the power that silence has in communication. Instead of looking to constantly diagnose what you see, the behavior that you're encountering or dealing with, just describe it, right? Learn to describe, hey, you look like you're feeling down. How can I help? Instead of trying to go about understanding their backstory and their childhood and all these different types of things that could be contributing to why they feel down. Like it could be something super simple. It could be something very complex. No matter what, it always starts with the ability to describe and not diagnose. I think that's a pretty powerful reminder that if you can do that and remember accuracy over abundance and marry those two together, you're going to do pretty well.
Where is it that you focus your attention now? Like, you alluded to earlier that you're understanding that you're never going to bat 1,000, and there's something human about that, but it doesn't mean that we're not trying to. And I think that's always a little bit that gets lost. I think when people understand that perfection isn't possible, they think perfection isn't the goal, which I think still very much is. Like I walk into a session, I think, how can I make this perfect? I think that should be the aim, even if so unattainable. What are things at this point in your career, if we flip to the page of the chapter that you're in, what are the things that you focus on? Or is it still just refining the same tools that you've refined? Or is there a new horizon for your understanding in communication as it applies to coaching?
I would say because the job often brings in working with people that speak a different language, that come from a different culture, that's where my focus is right now, is better understanding if I'm going to be working with a certain population of athletes, there's going to be a certain archetype. What makes that up? What kind of socioeconomic backgrounds do they come from? What countries do they come from? What language do they speak? And a better appreciation for the kind of cultural mosaic that represents the archetype of that athlete. I think that's something where I spend a lot of my time now, and it can be simple. It can be, either reading a book that has nothing to do with performance, or just reading a book that has something to do with that country or that culture. I think talking to people, bringing this full circle around, talking to people about food, to bring this full circle to the origins of my story, is such a huge, gateway conversation for me. And I talked to a few coaches at L3, and it was a powerful moment for them. Like, it's such a universally appreciated thing, something that we all, obviously gravitate towards, whether it's an appreciation from a cultural standpoint or how it affects fuel for performance or whatever it is. This idea of understanding food as part of this dialogue and communication as a powerful tool, I think, is something that I'm super interested in as well.
I think this is like a big takeaway, which is like kind of circling back to your own interest. And I think that's one of the nicest things about coaching, is that like you can put your flavor, your passion on it and find a way to connect. Like, everyone eats food, right? And I think there's that example in every coach and their dimension that intersects coaching, right? Like your dimension as communication, but is born out of this origin story coming out of the restaurant and circling back, quite literally full circle to that as a gateway into conversation to start attaining some of the details. And I think that's something that people struggle with. And I think I think the common assumption with great coaches is that they just think about coaching all day long, and they're like, I'm just like, I wouldn't even know how you would do that other than actually coaching all day and just like being immersed in it. But just sit there, just being like, how do you think about coaching all day? It's like thinking about philosophy. It's really something that's better off practiced than spoken about. But it's just like, it's so true of all of the coaches that I sort of, hold in high regard and revere, is that there's so much dimension to them, that it's like coaching is just a conduit, and it's another intersecting dimension. And that is what makes them great. It's not a byproduct. It doesn't detract, but it's just another way to connect. So it's super interesting to hear that, because I think a lot of people, and we see it, as they look to be hyper academic, and they look to maybe diagnose, and they look for abundance, and they look for all of maybe the right answers in the wrong places. It's great to hear a coach, so far into the game and at the highest level, just go like, yeah, it's probably just better if you kind of just like be yourself and be interested in that, and then people will gravitate towards that. So I think that's a super powerful message to end on. And maybe I'll throw it back to you if there's any other notes you wanted to kind of toss in there, or advice or final notes on for young coaches kind of getting into this, like what maybe a piece of advice you find yourself giving most often, or something to close out.
Yeah, I appreciate that complexity of, your humanity, your humanness applies to them too. I think sometimes we look at these people, particularly if we're working with elite athletes, it's like they're so damn good at the thing that they do, better than any of us will ever be at anything that we do. And it's very easy then to just assume that that's them. That's all they are. They must go to bed and think about hockey or basketball at all times. And in some cases that's true. And that's, that's another little data point that you can put on the board of building these kind of personality profiles, the obsession that they have with their sport, their craft, or whatever. And in sometimes it's not true, right? So what other things are they interested? Really get to know the person behind the athlete, because regardless if it's dealing with injury or a personality type, you always start individual first, right? You always start human first, and then build towards athleticism, then build towards, how that applies to their training from there.
Play the man, Dante Martella. Appreciate the time, dude.
My man, looking forward to doing it again.